All right. Hey, this is John Kane. We've got Regan DeLagas, and this is Let's Talk. Sorry to miss you last week, but we're back here now, and we got plenty to talk about. There's always plenty to talk about. What we're going to do this week is we're going to talk about something we haven't really addressed on this program before, and something that's become a bit of a movement with a name, and it's basically being called Land Back. And as a hashtag, it's trending, and it's become basically a name to the to our efforts to reclaim lost land. And I want to talk a little bit about how we lost land, for one thing. So it's amazing how many people don't know. Everybody assumes that we were either just driven off land or that we had land stolen in some, obscure way, But I want to get into the details because it's going to relate back to a specific issue that is playing out right now in Ontario, or rather on the Six Nations reserve or territory in Ontario, where there's a battle over settlement occupation, just like Israel and Palestine, apparently. So let me introduce Regan. Regan, it's good to have you back, and for us to be back.
Yeah, it's always great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think that before we jump into it, I think we should give a little background about land back, about the terminology land back, and why it's become what it has become.
Go ahead, please do.
Sure, of course. Okay, so to start with, land back has been, as you said, trending on Instagram, on social media. It started as a hashtag, and it's really grown into a movement. And I've actually written quite extensively on this. And the biggest thing to understand about land back is that it is a response to the huge amount of appropriation for the term decolonize. When decolonize became popular, and also through social media, it was then co-opted by a number of people. You see like decolonize the syllabus, decolonize social work, decolonize your bank, decolonize Instagram, things like that. And Eve Young and Tuck put out this incredible article out of the State University of New York called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, in which they specifically pushed back on this, saying that the bastardization and the co-option of decolonize has actually rendered it useless, because so many people have used the term in conjunction with colonial structures, institutions, ideology. And so decolonize became a term that lost its power. When at first it was meant to be empowering, it really lost its power. So, we live in an age of social media.
Let me just jump in for a second, because even amongst Native people, that's been the occurrence. Because I think Native people are misusing the word decolonization. Because when I talk about decolonization as the stripping away of some of the systems of oppression. I'm not even talking about dismantling them. I'm not talking about changing the United States, Constitution, or I'm talking about us as Native people stripping that away. So when I talk about decolonization, I'm talking about us developing our systems, bringing back some of our old systems, and stripping away the systems of oppression that have been imposed upon us. And I know that it doesn't. And when I hear some of the people who are on one hand is saying get out the native vote, and in the same breath saying decolonize, those two things aren't consistent with each other.
And see, the way that I interpret decolonize is the way that Tuck and Young explained it, which is that decolonization is about land. It's about returning land. It's about reclaiming land. It all boils down back to land. So when you say things like decolonize your syllabus, which is then transposed into academia, the term has lost its power because it's all about re-intensifying indigeneity and indigenizing spaces. And decolonization has, especially when used in indigenous communities, has come under fire for a lot of reasons for being anti-Black. Because often decolonization, the conversation on decolonization doesn't include land back to those who were enslaved. So the point is decolonization has had, over the past, I guess now it's 7 years, maybe even longer, but let's say 5 to 7 years, the term decolonize really ramped up. Museums use it in their public programming. People write about it, people post about it, and it's become this term that has it's become synonymous to change, like change your syllabus is an example versus decolonize your syllabus. You can't decolonize a syllabus is what I'm trying to get across here. So the term land back is in the same way that decolonization originally was meant to do, is a new term, is a new phrase that is specifically about the rematriation, the reparations, and the actionable results and that we are asking for, or demanding rather, in land back. And land back covers everything. It covers taking land back by force, it's land back through peaceful protest, land back through rematriation, land back through gift giving. It is an all-encompassing phrase with the intention to really rectify the loss that we had in terms of the bastardization and the co-option of the term decolonization. So, and of course, just like decolonize, land back is now being appropriated. You can get land back shirts, you can get land back this, you can get land back that. I myself have a land back mask. So, there are definitely, we have to be careful about co-option of empowering terms and phrases to just become another point of ways to make money.
Right.
So that's just something that's definitely something that I want to kind of suss out for folks. But so land back is if you ask me, is the new decolonize. Right. It is.
Well, and to your point,
it's a call to action.
To your point about decolonization being about land, and that's not inconsistent with what I'm saying, because when we're talking about stripping away oppression, we are really talking about stripping away the land occupation. So reclaiming by whatever means we can, reclaiming our use, our land use, our land rights, and rectifying some of the, obviously the land loss. But one thing I want to talk about, because there is a lot of confusion on where much of the land loss occurred. And I want to offer a scenario that perhaps some of our listeners aren't familiar with. We didn't just arbitrarily lose land or even arbitrarily cede land. We didn't sell land to make money and to sustain ourselves. We weren't doing, that's not what we did. But what did happen was, through our more open idea of what land is, and certainly not sharing the same views of land ownership that Europeans did in terms of property and ownership and something they could claim for forever. We did not close off use of our lands to other people. And oftentimes there were these leases, and some of these leases our people were really, really manipulated over. So there would be leases entered into for 99 years, or worse, 999 years, which is absurd, because how do you have a lease that's practically 1,000 years old? I mean, it's absurd. And what happens with it, almost to a point of every single one of these agreements, the lease payments would stop. And so rather than the leases being declared default, and let me say this also, many of these leases were drafted by white people, and they were accepted by governments, whether they were state governments or federal governments or provincial governments or Canadian federal governments. So these leases were entered into, and then they would sit there and default. Our people, Native people, we did not have standing to enter into courts, either in the U.S. or the Canadian side. So we had no recourse to resolve a defaulted lease. And they damn sure were going to evict a bunch of white people off of Native lands. So oftentimes what was the driving effect of these treaty negotiations that were trying to get land cessions was because white people were already living there and they weren't paying for it, and so that lease income had disappeared and all of that other stuff. And I say this because it's going to be relevant to talking about what's happening in Six Nations later on as we get there. But I wanted people to understand that much of the lands that were lost through the fraud committed not just with bad treaties, but through these leases. And of course, us being not in a situation, again, because of racism, overt racism, that we didn't have the standing to ever hold white people to account to their words, whether it was a state, whether it was the federal government, or whether it was individuals who were trying to acquire land. And I think that is one of the examples of land loss that people are just not familiar with.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because I recently posted something on Instagram that said something like, blah, 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 on, like, no blah, blah, blah on stolen land, whatever the terminology that was that I used. And someone reached out and it was like, I think it's important, and it's an Indigenous person, mind you. I think it's important that, like, before we post those, like, no stolen land, to learn the history of the land that we are on. Was the land stolen? Was it leased? Was it? I mean, I think all land was stolen, which was what my argument was, because I believe that every aspect of genocide and land theft boils down to it being stolen. Assimilation is theft, genocide is theft, all of these things. But they brought up a really great point, saying that each land area, and also some nations never ceded their territory. Right. So I really like that this person brought that up for me. And they're a First Nations person, so they have a different history to land back to their land in the first place. So it was an interesting conversation to have, and it really did personally challenge me to think about the specific histories of each occupation, of each land, the history of what actually happened in the space, especially considering, as I said, that not all nations ever ceded their land. So what does that mean in terms of the land back, or what does that mean in terms of stolen land? So yeah. I'm glad that these conversations are starting to be had, because I myself am ignorant to a lot of those histories.
Well, and the foundation for a lot of the land title disputes comes from the doctrine of Christian discovery, which becomes codified in U.S. law and then utilized by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these other places, Africa. But it's interesting that the way that the doctrine of Christian discovery becomes codified into U.S. law was through a lease dispute. It were two separate white parties, or Johnson and McIntosh, who both claimed to have leases. One claimed to be leasing it from the Cherokee, and one claimed to be leasing it from the state. As it turns out, the lands didn't even conflict with each other, but it became this lessee, Johnson v. McIntosh, and this is when the Justice John Marshall brings into into U.S. law this notion that Native people don't hold title. That upon discovery, our sovereignty was diminished, and that somehow the title to land became vested in the United States after through the British Crown and then through independence. Of course, we know that that's BS. But that becomes codified in law, and although it is contradicted by treaties, by the reality on the ground in many places, this lays the foundation for the United States to still to this day claim underlying title, even when there is no evidence that not only were lands never ceded, but there was never even any event or document or anything that shows where lands became out of our control or out of out from our title to their title. So I think it's really important that people understand where the leases fit into some of these conversations, because these defaulted leases would oftentimes lead to these large cessions of land just so white people wouldn't have to be inconvenienced. And that's literally the language they used in a lot of the legislation that and the legal cases associated with this stuff. So and of course, when we talk about land back and we talk about generally, in the words of the Grand Council of the Haudenosaunee back in the 70s, it was said that we need to reclaim land by hook or by crook. So by whatever means necessary. Well, the reality is, as far as the federal government's concerned, there is only one process for lands to go from being taxable lands within state and federal government definitions to quote unquote Indian country, and that's the fee to trust process, which is a debacle all by itself. And we've seen that play out with the Mashpee, who were going through this process and basically had their application approved to have the Trump administration say, "Nah, we don't recognize. We don't think that you sufficiently provided evidence that not only that you are under U.S. jurisdiction today, but that you were under jurisdiction back in 1934." An absurd proposition, but that's the parameters. And of course, in the midst of all this fee to trust applications are not just with the Mashpee, but time and time again the denials and the rejections of Native people trying to reclaim lands that were either gotten from them illegally in the first place or under questionable circumstances. Now, I do want to juxtapose that a little bit against the recent ruling in Oklahoma, which basically acknowledges kind of what I just said, is that there are circumstances where there's never been a redesignation of lands that the United States recognizes as native lands to cease to be recognized as native lands. And that's how almost half of Oklahoma is now being looked at through a different lens, saying, yeah, we think the underlying title still rests with the Choctaw or various, who are the other, there were a couple of other native territories.
Yeah, it's Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Cherokee.
Right.
And as of right now, the most successful have been Creek Nation, which won the Supreme Court ruling just last month. And now we'll see what happens with Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, as well as Seminole. But I believe Choctaw and Chickasaw are next in the docket, if you will.
Sure. So
I think that before.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that for folks that have any questions, I think that fee to trust land acquisition can be complicated for those who don't know anything about it. And I, even as an Indigenous person, knew very little about it until we talked about this a couple months ago with the Mashpee.
Right.
So I just want to let folks know that though I hate the Bureau of Indian Affairs, 100%, they do have a good pamphlet that is available for folks to read about what fee to trust is. And they have a frequently asked questions section, which is honestly where I got most of my information. And it was even more upsetting that I had to do it on the BIA website. But they explain what is fee to trust land acquisition, and they discuss who is eligible for it. And honestly, after reading through this, I realized how difficult it is to even acquire land through this structure, and it's purposefully difficult so that the occupied United States can hold land in trust and avoid giving land back to Indigenous people. So, though it is incredibly informative on a number of levels, it's also incredibly informative in learning that this process is not meant to be easy.
Well, and just to just loosely and quickly explain, when we say fee, a title to land is considered fee title. It's a property term. So it just means that you individually own that land in fee title. So when we talk about fee to trust, what we're talking about is the land that goes from being owned individually with a fee title to being held in trust. And this is where it gets, and this is even problematic, where it's held by the federal government for the use and enjoyment of Native people. And I always like those terms because we make it sound like it's always enjoyment and never a battle, and it's always a battle. There's a great quote.
Go ahead. there's a great quote on this frequently asked questions thing that says, what is fee to trust land acquisition? And the explanation that they give is a fee to trust land acquisition is a transfer of land title from an eligible Indian tribe or eligible Indian individuals to the United States of America in trust for the benefit of the eligible Indian tribe or eligible Indian individuals.
Yeah.
First of all, I hate that they're still calling us Indians. Like, let's get into the 21st century, y'all. And second, it's, as you said, for the benefit or for the enjoyment. Like, this is land being withheld from us in trust by the government for us to enjoy.
Well, and again, so this is land that we're essentially buying in the open market by that definition, and then trying to take it out of, let's say, a state taxable deed scenario and having it placed into trust. Again, we literally give the land to the federal government so they can hold it for us, en masse, so to speak. I do have to say there is one exception to this. And that's the exception that exists in Seneca territory. Seneca's negotiated a lease settlement that for the city of Salamanca back in, and they came to a conclusion with this settlement in 1990. And so the 1990 Salamanca Lease Settlement Act has a provision at the end of it. It's only one paragraph long, and it basically says the Senecas can reacquire Aboriginal territory, their land back with the settlement funds that they received. And it was essentially a 30-day process. And that land would not be held in trust. The land would revert back to Seneca title, original Seneca title. So it would be held as the same status as Cattaraugus and Allegheny are. So that's the only real exception, and it's a dramatic exception because it's a completely different scenario in terms of what is how the title of the land rests, and the fact that it doesn't go through the very arduous task of going through this fee to trust land application. Now, I wanted to say that, but I also want to say the same thing exists on the Canadian side, and in the Canadian side, it's even even more rare occurrence that Native people actually get the land back into their control. There's been example after example over lands that were clearly taken through fraud and through again defaulted leases and all that other stuff. And when we come back from break, I'm going to explain that this is the exact scenario that's playing out with what they call the Haldeman Tract. And what the folks at Six Nations are fighting in terms of a housing development that is being put up right at the doorstep of the Six Nations or Oswego or Grand River Reserve. So what we're talking about here in the U.S. is the same thing that happens on the Canadian side. In fact, almost all native territory in the U.S. and Canada, almost all of it is, while it may be designated Indian country, the federal government claims, on the Canadian side and the U.S. side, claims to hold that title for Native people. There's small examples. Seneca territory, Haudenosaunee lands are held in fee by their own title. They call it restricted fee, by the way, because they claim the only way we could sell it would be to the United States, which is a whole other question. But so I just wanted to lay some of that out because I think it's important that people understand that even the idea of somebody donating land back to us, it's a very difficult process, and oftentimes we end up with land that the state and the counties, are still designating as taxable lands, even though they're being held by Native people. Yep. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more.
What? No, sorry. There was a lag for a second.
Yeah.
What I was going to say was, I think that's also something that people need to understand is when land is gifted back, let's say from a person, they just give us our land back casually, that there is still taxes to be paid on that land. It's not like we are exempt of that just because it's being gifted back to Indigenous people, to Indigenous hands, which of course is, just despicable if you ask me, and I assume if you ask a lot of people. It's just a despicable process to be expected to pay taxes on our land,
right?
In general, ever. especially in that process where it's being gifted back. Because the understanding here is that I'm giving back this land because I understand that it's not my land to have, and then in turn we pay. We have to pay taxes on it. So I wonder what the process will look like in the future, considering that a lot more settlers are starting to have conversations about giving land back, starting to give land back. And I wonder what that process will look like, because I don't doubt that Indigenous peoples are going to be like, hey, I'm not going to pay taxes on my land.
Well, and it's always an interesting battle when we get into the situation where we have reoccupied lands, and then we get into into a battle over taxation. In fact, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg opinion that was written in City of Sherrill versus Oneida was exactly that. Mm-hmm. That was the Oneidas reacquiring lost land, and the City of Sherrill trying to sue them for taxes. And ultimately, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and so the lower courts, which sided with City of Sherrill, stood. Eventually, there was it was worked out between the Oneidas and New York State, which has them paying 25% of their net slot drop from their casinos, and agreeing to a limited amount of land that they can reclaim back that would go through, again, the feed of trust process. But even when we acquire land, buying land in the open market or having it gifted to us, or however we end up with land under a state or a county deed, that's not the tough part. That's the easy part. The tough part is getting the federal government to acknowledge that we have the legitimate right to reclaim that land as a part of our territories, not just John Kane's personal possession under state law. So this is where it really does get complicated. And again, what was demonstrated through the Mashpee case is the way that they can pull something back out from they're actually what they call the 1934 rule, basically says you cannot. No matter what the circumstances were associated with the loss of your land, you cannot reclaim or reacquire lands if you can't prove that in 1934 you were under U.S. jurisdiction. So they want, it's on the native peoples themselves to provide not just some sort of admission, but proof, documents, that are almost 100 years old, showing that they had been subjugated by the United States in 1934. It's a very, very difficult hoop to jump through, because even if the United States claimed jurisdiction, and even if we had to at some level acquiesce to that power of the United States in 1934, the idea that they want us to admit today that we are subjugated or that we were subjugated that's just a tough requirement, and an unnecessary requirement, I might add. So
I also want to remind listeners that all of this conversation only relates to federally recognized tribes.
Yes.
If you are an Indigenous person of a non-federally recognized tribe, which, by the way, the majority of tribes are not federally recognized, but if you are part of a non-federally recognized tribe, none of this is available. Like, you do not have access to land, access to healthcare, access to any of this. So even having this conversation is incredibly specific to federally recognized tribes. Well,
and of course, the definition of federally recognized tribes says that you are a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. And
exactly.
so it's like this whole thing, there's so much doublespeak and contradiction, and it shows that every step along the way, whether it was the 14th Amendment, whether it was the Indian Citizenship Act, or the Reorganization Act, or whatever has transpired over the centuries, there is still a real question mark about. For me, I don't claim to be a U.S. citizen. I'm Mohawk. I'm Gunyagahaga. I'm a part of the Haudenosaunee. That's who I am, and I don't feel the imposition of U.S. citizenship would ever have been legitimate unless I consented to it, or unless. And I'm not even saying my grandparents or somebody before me could have sold out that birthright of mine. That's something that is violates some of the not just the cultural practices, but the identity of who we are. Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break. We'll have Reggie take us out for a tune here. We'll grab a drink here, and I'll come back. What I want to do in the second part of the show is bring this home to what's happening on the ground today in Six Nations, and what is now being coined a new address, 1492 Land Back Lane, which is now the home address for Native Resistance. So we'll get to that. We'll get to that when we get back. This is John Kane and Regan DeLoggins, and this is Let's Talk. We'll be right back. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins, and we're gonna kind of get into the specifics. There is a conflict that has been brewing, and and much of it's some of the same MO. I mean, rubber bullets, tear gas, pepper spray, militarized police, the whole bit. But let me go back a little bit to about 2006, when the first conflict over what was called Caledonia, which is a little, what's considered a township just outside, just on the edge of what is considered the Six Nation Reserve, also called Oswego or Grand River. And they were trying to build these luxury homes there, and it's on disputed land. Now, the reason it's disputed land is because there is a tract of land that runs from Lake Erie, where Grand River dumps into Lake Erie, all the way. It's supposed to go all the way to its source, which on 6 miles either side of Grand River, all that land was designated to the Six Nations by the King of England before Canada was even a distinct entity, so to speak. So, and this was born out of some of the conflicts between between Great Britain and the United States, even as late as the War of 1812. And when the Treaty of Paris was signed, I think that's what it was. The Treaty of Paris was signed between Britain and the United States. Mohawks and others from Six Nations said, "Wait a second, you just agreed to a border across our land?" And so, and many of the folks from Six Nations, Mohawks in particular, basically fought on some of them, not all of them. Some of them fought on the side of Great Britain. And so the king felt that he had to do something to reward. So this was 6 miles on either side of Grand River from the lake to its source was designated as the land set aside specifically and acknowledged to be the lands of the Six Nations. Now, again, the whole lease discussion we had in the first half, that's where the people of Six Nations knew that they could not just squat on that land with their limited numbers and avoid conflicts. So they felt, we enter into leases, now we'll have a legal record and all that other stuff. So our people were pretty sophisticated, even if our command of legal documents wasn't great. And so that's how much of what is called the Haldeman Tract became occupied by non-native people, and they all defaulted on the leases. Most of that money was supposed to have gone into accounts that were supposed to be very secure for the Six Nation. They would ultimately get looted and claimed to have been put into a trust fund, and then Canada would try to offer to pay back for that loss of land out of our own trust funds. I mean, the whole thing is just such a debacle. It's insane. So some of that land is still not occupied. But today we have a scenario that looks like Israel and Palestine, with developers trying to develop settlements right at the doorstep of Six Nations that is on this disputed land. So that's what kind of blew up in 2006. Our people had protested and had put a stop to it, and there's some dramatic imagery, that captured a lot of that from back then. And the fight we put up then was enough to put everything on hold. Well, just recently, they just started trying to rebuild and start another development in this area of Caledonia or that area around there. Again, right on the doorstep. I mean, right on the doorstep of what would be considered the border to Six Nations Reserve. So a bunch of not the chiefs, not the elected chiefs, not band councils, not politicians, but the people there said, "Oh, hell no. we're not,
Yeah.
we're not tolerating this. So the first thing they did was just go there and set up and occupy a spot within the development area. They didn't do blockades. They just occupied. They built a little fire and they tended it 24 hours a day. And this is going back just a couple of weeks ago. Ultimately, the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, which is essentially like state police on the U.S. side, the provincial police, they showed up with an injunction in hand and told the people they had to clear out. And they told them, look, we have no intention to clear it out. Now, it was a small group of people. It wasn't a large group. And then the OPP came in with tear gas, with automatic weapons, and our people don't know what's in the
Rubber bullet.
Well, you find out that the rubber bullet, when somebody pulls out a shotgun and shoots at you, you don't know it's a rubber bullet. And frankly, even when it hits you, you don't know it's a rubber bullet because you think you've been killed. But they came in and with pure violent intent to clear out these peaceful protesters, and that's what occurred up there. And they did clear them out, but then the people came out, and they came out en masse, and they drove out they just physically with their bodies, not with weapons, not with anything else. They showed up there and essentially drove out the OPP, and as a result of the violence that their people were victimized with, they decided, all right, now we're not just lighting a fire on a piece of property. Now we're blocking off some of these roads, and so roads and rail, just like back in January when we were seeing some of this in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people, the people of Six Nations have come out and they've made a stand, and the place they occupied, they relabeled. Somebody said, "What's the address for this place?" And they said, and somebody in their infinite wisdom said, "This is 1492 Landback Lane." So that is the new address.
I love it.
That is great. So what I've been posting is that 1492 Landback Lane is the new address for Native resistance, and I'm proud of what these folks are doing. I mean, they're showing tremendous discipline, and they're not excluding anybody. They've met with band council, they've met with tribal council, they've met with different groups within the community to say, look, this is what we're trying to do here. And of course, there are always going to be those who say, "Oh no, we have to agree to this or we have to agree to that." And there's a few people that undermine their efforts, but in general, it is a really broad-based grassroots movement that is really securing the place to prevent development of these. And some of these homes are like, they're multi-family dwellings for $400,000, $500,000. I mean, and it's not like the people of Six Nations don't have their own housing crisis, but in the meantime, you've got this going on.
Well, I think that, so the land in question was acquired by Foxgate Development back in 2015 from Haldimand County. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Haldimand. Okay. I was like, I don't know. That's a weird name. Anyway, but in 2019, the Six Nations elected council, which is a band council, signed an accommodation agreement with the developers that amounted to about 42.3 acres and like $352,000. Now,
which is less than the cost of one of the homes. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah.
Exactly. Which is what I was about to say, which is like, this is less than the amount of one of the homes, how much the home will be worth after the development. Now, we've talked about band councils in the past because they did the same thing at Wet'suwet'en and allowing the pipeline through, and band councils do not speak for the nation. And I think that the statistic that I found is really important, which says that the support for the band council as of the last election was 4%. 4% of the 27,000 people within the community of Six Nations.
Well, so and I think to clear, one of the reasons that the people don't support band councils is because they are essentially extensions of the Canadian government. They are exactly. In fact, the Canadian government views them as municipal governments within their system of federalism. That's the way they're viewed there, and so you don't even necessarily have to be Longhouse to oppose this idea that that the Canadian government is trying to shove a municipal government down their throats just with Native people, Native faces in it. And so that's why there is such a lack of support. One of the reasons there's such a lack of support there. But you're right. 4% of the population was the most they could get muster for a band council election. That's how little support they have.
Out of 27,000 community members.
It is essentially the most populated and the biggest reservation, and I say that word with some reservations, but that's one of the biggest territories on the Canadian side and the most populated territory on the Canadian side as far as a designated native territory, and only 4% of the population support what Canada calls the government.
And this tract of land, this like about 42.3 acres, is close, as you said, to the recognized reservation, but Haldimand Tract Treaty grants the Haudenosaunee people 6 miles, which is about 10 kilometers, on either side of the Grand River. So in the end, this land is not and should never have been acquired by Foxgate Development in 2015. So starting on July 19th, there was a group of Six Nations land defenders, along with other folks, but specifically Six Nations land defenders, who sat on this portion of land of this development of so-called Caledonia, in order to stop the continued development of what would have been called Mackenzie Meadows, which was going to be a proposed 218 houses on this site, which, of course, like 218 proposed houses on Indigenous land when there's a housing crisis on the reservation literally next door, like how tone deaf. And as of August 5th is when the OPP violently raided, Indigenous folks who were, occupying this space. And as you said, folks came back in larger numbers and drove off the OPP. So now we're at this specific space, which is like, what are next steps? What is this continuation? What are conversations that are being had? And, of course, I stand with Six Nations. I stand with 1492 Land Back Lane, and I am excited that there is a continued occupation of this space. And I actually personally, I'm personally excited to see what next steps look like in terms of reclamation of this land. Have some of the houses been built? Can we start occupying these houses? There's a lot of next steps that are happening, but this is, happening at this moment. And what I also really appreciated seeing was that Wet'suwet'en land defenders came forward and started to block off train rails in the same way that Six Nations did during the height of the at the height of the Wet'suwet'en crisis. You saw Six Nations people blocking off railways, saying, y'all are going to come onto Wet'suwet'en land, then we're going to stand with Wet'suwet'en, and Wet'suwet'en is doing the same. There was a blockade yesterday that is still happening in solidarity with 1492 Land Back Lane. So we are seeing an emergence. We're seeing the other side of what was happening.
Well, and a lot of this stuff has a direct correlation and causation, I guess, and a connection to what took place 30 years ago. 30 years ago, during this same time, there was a major standoff. People know it as Oka or Gunazadage between Mohawks and the village of Oka and the province of Quebec. It turned into again, a violent assault that came in from the Quebec Provincial Police, which are called the SQ, that came in firing shots. Shots were exchanged. One police officer was actually killed. It turned into a standoff that lasted all summer long, where people were holding up in Gunazadage. And this was all the intent of the mayor of Oka to expand a 9-hole golf course onto Mohawk lands in Gunazadage. So, and this is 30 years ago. So what we're seeing playing out now, and this included what transpired in January with Wet'suwet'en and the solidarity blockades that were done by Mohawks then. This was almost a continuation and again a repayment of the broad-based support that Native territories throughout Canada gave to Ganazadage and Ganawage when they were, essentially at war with Canada over the Oka crisis. So, and this is an entire new generation. None of these guys were there. They were. I mean, it was 30 years ago. These guys are only about 30 years old. Many of these young people, and any of the ones who were a little bit older than that were essentially kids at the time. So this is a new generation of Native resistance, and that's what is so exciting to me for somebody who's been kind of at this for a while. Seeing a new generation that steps up in ways that take the baton farther than we took it. And obviously this Haldeman tract, this land issue has been going on for a long time with Six Nations, and it is coming a bit to a head. I do have to say that the Ontario Premier, which is like a governor, Doug Ford, he's made his statements, and he said, well, you can't just go into somebody else's house and take over their house. I'm thinking, that's exactly what you did. And then they also spew out all of this rule of law stuff, but they never enforce their own laws. And they're trying to, against their own people, the ones who committed the fraud in the first place. And now they want to impose their so-called rule of law over people who never consented to be under that law. And I say that, it's the same on the U.S. side as on the Canadian side. As Native people, we've never, I don't care what law they've passed, we have never consented to subjugation. And there's no documents that either on the U.S. or the Canadian side that can back up any claim that they have a legitimate claim to jurisdiction over us as people or over our lands, other than what they have done just with might. They haven't done it with any kind of legal or moral foundation to what they're doing.
I mean, I laugh to keep from crying sometimes because this is because the contradictions and the hypocrisy are just like so obvious to me, to you, to all of us. I think saying like, oh, you can't just come into our house and take things, and I'm like, I mean, I'm pretty sure we said that back in 1492, baby.
Yeah.
But here we are now. And I really do, I ask folks to look up more about what is happening here at 1492 Landback Lane. And also, there is a fund to support the work that is being done there, to support those who were arrested, to support those who are still occupying the space. And if you look, I can pull that up.
You can go on Facebook. They also have a Facebook group page, which is 1492 Landback Lane, and you'll find the links. In fact, I did a show just a couple of nights ago with some of the folks that are involved in that standoff, in that occupation and blockade. So you can see a lot of information, some incredible pictures and images and videos that are there. So you can find that on Facebook. I know there's a couple of other places. Real People's Media is another place that you can find a bunch of information. But yeah, including places that you can make donations. The interesting thing is the idea of arresting people and then holding them in jail has become very problematic because of COVID-19. So they are less prone to want to hold people. So it's almost like a revolving door if they're going to arrest people. So that's an interesting thing as well. So, but again, I think it's worth checking out. I think people have to understand that, for anybody who, again, retains this idea that Canada is such a nice place and that it's some utopian, society, there's as much overt racism, although it is predominantly directed towards Native people. Although there's a couple of recent reports, coming out of the city of Toronto, just how bad how disproportionate the arrests and convictions and jailing and imprisonment of black people are in the city of Toronto. Look, it's just classic European colonial racism that lies at the foundation of all this stuff. Hey, I do want to mention one other thing, Regan. I don't know if you know this, and I think Reggie knows this, but I do 2 Let's Talk Native shows per week. One of them is being broadcast by WPFW in Washington D.C. on Fridays at 2 p.m. So if you're a Pacifica listener, if you're listening online, perhaps, and you ever want to check out some of the other Pacifica stations, Friday at 2 p.m. Let's Talk Native with John Kane. No Regan on that one, but Let's Talk Native is being featured on WPFW again Friday at 2 p.m. I do want to tell people you can check out my website. It is letstalknative.com. There's links to our YouTube page, our podcast, and all that other stuff. So I do encourage people to check it out. There's a lot to stay on top of here. I know we didn't really get into much on Kamala Harris, although she doesn't have a really good history when it comes to Native issues relating to California, whether you're talking about gaming, whether you're talking about fee to trust applications. She gave a defense of her position on the fee to trust applications, basically saying it wasn't her fault. She was just the governor's lawyer. Yeah, she literally said it wasn't her fault that she worked for the governor, and so it was the governor's position on this stuff. Crazy.
I guess it's just a reminder to everyone that there's no such thing as a good cop.
Well, and there you go. Look, I'm not going to vote in this election. I don't vote in U.S. Election, state or otherwise. And I'm not telling people how to vote. But if you're wondering what the Native perspective is, and I'm not talking about Deborah Hallen or Sharice David. I mean the Native people who live on a Native territory. If you're wondering what our perspective is on some of these people, whether it's Trump, who, yes, we loathe him too, but we don't have great history with the Democrats or the Republicans, and I think that's one of the reasons that it's always a difficult conversation for you and I to have on New York radio. Look, New York's going to vote for Biden and Harris. I mean, it's a blue state. There's nothing we're going to do to change that. But I think it's important that people hold them accountable. I think there are some gaming issues. I think there are some land issues, and there are some. We get lip service paid to us all the time by Biden and even by Harris. Let's hold them account and see what happens.
I think if people want to know what the indigenous perspective is, it's at 1492 Land Back Lane. So go check it out there. I did pull up their support line, which is landback6nations@gmail.com.
Okay.
You can send e-transfers to them to continue to support the work that they're doing.
All right. Sounds good. Regan, always a delight. We'll see you next week.
Always. All right.
All right. Thanks for listening and watching. We'll see you next week. Nyaway.